Wired.com presents The Geek's Guide to the Galaxy. And here is your host, David Barr Kirtley.
Hello, and welcome to episode 345 of Geek's Guide to the Galaxy. Our guest today is Christian Davenport. He's been a staff writer at the Washington Post since 2000, and he currently covers the space and defense industries for the Financial Desk. And we'll be speaking with him today about his new book, The Space Barons, which explores the world of private spaceflight through the eyes of four billionaires: Elon Musk, Jeff Bezos, Richard Branson, and Paul Allen. And this interview will focus mostly on Jeff Bezos, since we've previously discussed Elon Musk back in episode 154, and Richard Branson and Paul Allen back in episode 221. So definitely check those out if you missed them. And there is a bit of background noise on this call from the Washington Post newsroom, but it mostly disappears after about 10 minutes, so definitely stick with it. And so now here's our interview with Christian Davenport. All right, so we're here with Christian Davenport. Welcome to the show.
Thanks for having me.
Okay, and so your new book is called The Space Barons. So how'd this book come about?
Well, I've been covering, the commercial space industry for the Washington Post, for several years. And, the more I wrote about it, the more I kind of came to believe that what we were witnessing or what I was, putting in the paper every day really amounted to, something bigger. I mean, it just sort of transcended the coverage of the that I could do for the Washington Post. And to me, if you put it together, what, Elon Musk and Jeff Bezos and Richard Branson and the late Paul Allen were doing, sort of amounted to the beginning, or the beginnings of a new era in space. And so I thought I wanted to try to capture that in a book, because I think it's the sort of thing that we'll look back on in 20, 30, 40 years from now as a transformative time in space. So that's what I was trying to do with the book.
So what was the process like of writing the book? Was it fun? Was it challenging?
It is my second book, and I think, the process is always fun to have written a book. Now it feels great. But, it's really hard. The thing with a book is that you just, at least the way I work, you never let it go. You're working every day. It's always in the back of your mind. It's just sort of like an all-consuming life suck. I mean, it's just totally obsessive. But, there is, as a friend of mine used to say, there is the liberating, power of commitment, right? And when you commit to a project like this, there is something, liberating, and that's what you're doing, with your life. And, the good thing was it's a story that, I think is really interesting. I'm obsessed with it. I wrote the book. It came out. I still covered for the Post. I mean, it's just such an interesting time what's going on in space. So, in that regard, it was, it's really cool. And then the story, continues to this day with all of these companies and what they're doing. So, maybe in some respects, what I've just written is, sort of really a first chapter to a much larger story.
I mean, you were able to take a year off to write the book. Is that right?
Yeah, I took about 10 months off, from my job at the Post. I was at the Wilson Center. It's a think tank in D.C., which was nice. They put me up, sort of had an office, had great research facilities, got, documents from the Library of Congress. It's nice, to have a place to force you to get up and get out of the house in the morning. I also have 3 young kids, that wreak a little bit of havoc. So it was good to have a place to go.
So when you pitched this to publishers, was there automatic interest, or was it a bit more of a hard sell?
Yeah, I mean, I think there was interest, but I think it was still a little bit early in some respects that, people had sort of heard about SpaceX, they had known about Elon Musk, but, people didn't realize that Jeff Bezos, a lot of people don't even realize that Jeff Bezos, has a space company, and that, his true passion is space. But, I do think that we did have enough, interest in a lot of people, and obviously it was a great story, and it's done really well, thankfully. And it was, and that's what I had said when I was talking to Jeff Bezos to try to get him to participate in the book. I was like, people see you through the lens of Amazon as, obviously they should, but I think they should also see you through the lens of space, because I think, frankly, that's what he's, most passionate about. And Blue Origin, as he's, said since, is, some of the most important work he's been doing.
Well, right. And so the book, you focus on these four billionaires who've gotten into private space enterprises. So Jeff Bezos, you mentioned, Elon Musk, Paul Allen, and Richard Branson. And you were able to get interviews with all four of them. So how did you manage to pull that off?
Well, I had interviewed Elon and Jeff and Richard as a Washington Post reporter, and was one of the few reporters that was invited out to Blue Origin in early 2016 to get a tour of the factory, and they spent some time with Jeff there. And so I knew, him and his people from doing that. Had also, obviously spent a lot of time covering SpaceX, had interviews with, Elon Musk before, and had built those relationships up over time. Same with Richard Branson, Virgin Galactic, had been covering their company. The hardest one, frankly, was Paul Allen, who obviously, died last year. But, he was, the most reclusive of the bunch. And, I was sort of interested, although his role in his company, plays a much smaller role in the book. So it was interesting that he was in some ways the more difficult to get. But, I had kept them, posted on what I was doing throughout. And then once I had, interviewed Jeff and Elon and Richard, I went to them and said, I've already interviewed these guys, and if you want in, now's the time. And they did. So I was grateful for that.
I mean, people might think, since you work for the Washington Post, which is owned by Jeff Bezos, that would have been kind of an automatic interview. But you had to go to some effort to interview him for this book, right? There was something involving a photo of his grandfather or something you had to show him?
Yeah, no, I mean, you would think that, and I wish that would help us get an in, but it's, we get usually the same, no comment and brush off, that everyone else gets, unfortunately. Right. So I had been, for months trying to get Jeff to participate. And, thankfully there was a period while I was writing the book where he was in DC a lot and going to a lot of space events that I would also get invited to. So I had the opportunity, frankly, to just, kind of go up and talk to him. And on a number of occasions, not just going to his, his PR people and saying, hey, I'm doing this book, but could take it directly to him. One of the first times I saw him, I knew he was big devotee of a guy named Gerard O'Neill, who wrote a book called The High Frontier. And if you hear Jeff Bezos talk about space, he's very much an O'Neillian, the sort of notion that we shouldn't just go to one particular planet, but he wants humanity just to spread out into space and live in habitats in space. And Gerard O'Neill was a professor at Princeton, where Jeff was a student. And so I went actually to the National Archives at the Air and Space Museum and got, they had some of Gerard O'Neill's papers. And I brought some of those papers to Jeff at an event, hoping that would spark his interest. That one didn't quite work out. He never did take Gerard O'Neill's class, even though he went to a lot of his lectures. So then that was sort of a swing and a miss. And then a few months later, I saw him at another event. And this time I brought a press release about his grandfather. And if you know anything about Jeff, his maternal grandfather played a huge role in his life. Jeff spent every summer of his childhood on his grandfather's ranch in South Texas. It was sort of really, very close relationship with his grandfather. And his grandfather was one of the first hires at ARPA, the predecessor to DARPA, which was founded, like NASA was in 1958 in reaction to Sputnik. And so in many ways, ARPA was sort of, a military space agency. And what I found in the archives was the press release from when Jeff's grandfather left ARPA to go back to work at the Atomic Energy Commission. And the press release had a picture of his grandfather on the release, a very big picture. And so I saw him, a few months later and handed him the press release, which he had never seen. And I could see, the expression on his face. And I just said, I'm putting my cards on the table. I'm just really trying to impress you. I'm writing this book. I really, that's when I said, I think people see you through the lens of Amazon. They should see you through the lens of space. I'm trying to impress you with the level of research I'm doing. And then I thought I had him. And he said, well, I'm inclined to participate. And then it took sort of another couple of months of working with his people to get on the schedule. But then I did. I got, another tour of the factory, a good long time with him. And I think, his insights, I think that's one of the things. I mean, Elon's out there. We know a lot about SpaceX. They're great at marketing, gets a lot of attention. But Blue Origin and Jeff Bezos have been much more, quiet and secretive about what they're doing. And I think that's, a lot of what, I was trying to do with the book was to open that up a little bit.
Well, right. I've previously interviewed Ashley Vance. He wrote a biography of Elon Musk, and I interviewed Julian Guthrie. She wrote a book about the X Prize and Spaceship One. So I was pretty well informed about some of the other characters in the book, but I really didn't know much about Jeff Bezos in terms of space. And like you were saying, I was sort of surprised to find out how much was going on with Blue Origin. And also, what sort of brought Jeff Bezos to my attention specifically was that he saved The Expanse, which is my favorite science fiction TV show.
Right.
And so that kind of made me curious, like, oh, is he a big science fiction fan? And so I started looking into it a little bit more. And there's a lot about that in your book that I'd like to talk about and focus on. So you mentioned that he would spend summers with his grandparents. And it sounds like he first discovered science fiction at the town library there. Is that right?
Yeah, and as it turned out, one of the town residents had this massive science fiction collection, Heinlein and Asimov and sort of, all the greats, and had donated to the local library there. It's this, really small, rural library in South Texas that just had this extraordinary collection, and Jeff just devoured it. And, I think he said read, over, from when he was a young boy all the way through high school, just devoured every episode. He's obviously also, a huge Trekkie. He named his dog Kampala after one of the characters. One of his holding companies is named after a Star Trek character. Zephram LLC is the name of the company, named for the character in Star Trek who created the warp drive, which is really interesting because one of the big things that Blue Origin, a space company, is doing is building sort of a big next generation engine. So he's got real ties. He even actually had a cameo in one of the Star Trek films. So that's obviously a huge influence over him.
Yeah, I actually just went and looked that up. So this is in Star Trek Beyond. And I'll just tell people how to find it because it's not easy to find, his cameo. But there's a scene near the beginning of the movie where an alien woman comes to the space station in distress and in need of help. And right before she's questioned by Captain Kirk, there's an alien who says to her, speak normally, and walks off screen. And that's Jeff Bezos in heavy prosthetics.
Yeah, and that's the thing. I mean, and he tweeted out a picture of him in, all dressed up, and you would have no idea it's him, which is, I'm sure, how he likes it. But yeah, it's pretty funny, that scene.
Well, so you mentioned that he was a devotee of Gerard O'Neill, and he's been sort of promoting O'Neill's ideas as far back as, at least as far as high school, in his valedictorian speech. Yeah,
and that's one of the really interesting things, that I, found and sort of came to realize in reporting the book is that, so today, his vision, this Gerard O'Neill vision that, that humanity should just go out and expand into space, and that this idea that, Earth is finite in its resources, but our population is growing and our demand for energy and resources is growing. But there's only, so much natural gas, so much, coal and, things we need to sort of fuel our modern day energy and to provide the power for our Kindles, which I'm sure he wants to do with Amazon. And that, but in space, all that is energy and resources are virtually unlimited in the sense that you can go and get, solar energy and there's no night and no day, and you don't have to worry about the atmosphere, and, eventually go to asteroids and do asteroid mining and refine metal. So he has this idea, that very much fits into the Gerard O'Neill vision of space, is that you go into space to preserve the Earth. And he's, today he gives this stump speech about, just kind of what I was saying about how you go out, to space to preserve Earth. And today he says, in his line that we should preserve Earth, it should be zoned residential. That Earth is this really magnificent place with waterfalls and palm trees and, snow and bacon and wine and whiskey and all these wonderful things. And that, other planets, for example, like Mars, which is where Elon Musk wants to go, are, really desolate and hard places to live. But that, Earth is where we evolved and wants to preserve it. So that's what he talks about today. But when he was 18 years old and giving a speech at his high school, it was virtually the same speech, but instead of saying, Earth should be zoned residential, he said Earth should be, preserved as a national park. So obviously this is something he's been thinking about for a very long time. And he said, that the high frontier that sort of embraces a lot of those ideals had a huge influence on him. And still today, that's what he, that's still his vision. So it's just remarkable to me how consistent he's been on that.
Well, just the way that you describe these O'Neill seminars at Princeton just sounds amazing. The book says, O'Neill's seminars, which were open to anyone on campus, would encourage those very capable students who weren't excited by ordinary coursework to look at applying physics to large-scale projects for the benefit of humanity. I wish there was something like that when I was in college. I might have been a lot more engaged.
Yeah, right. Yeah, just go to, lectures on the side with this brilliant professor to talk about space and space ideals. And in addition to doing that, he was, the president of the student, sort of space group on campus at Princeton, known as SEDS, which is, still sort of a big deal across college campuses today. And then even, after he left Princeton and went to work in New York at, D.F. Shaw, the sort of early hedge fund, before he founded Amazon, he, still was interested in space and went to an auction, I think it was at Sotheby's, where they were auctioning off all this Soviet space memorabilia. And he bid on a couple of items. Again, he wasn't, hadn't founded Amazon, didn't have billions of dollars, and lost out on the artifacts that he bid on. One was, I think, a chess set that you could use in space and, in microgravity, where there were nooks in the chess set so the pieces wouldn't float off the board. And another was a hammer that had these hollowed out head and these shavings that when you used the hammer and went forward, the weight would then, kind of go forward. Anyway, he lost those because I guess anonymously Ross Perot was going around bidding on everything. So he lost that to another billionaire at the time.
I just think it's so interesting from the point of view of Gerard O'Neill. I mean, unfortunately, he never lived to see any of this, but that, you just have to have the right influence on one student or, have your idea reach that one person who it really resonates with to have just a massive impact on the world.
Yeah, and it's funny, too, because like in researching, spending some time researching Gerard O'Neill, like today, a lot of people don't know him very well, and that, Jeff is, going out and adopting all of these ideals and, in many cases giving credit to Gerard O'Neill, but a lot of people think it's, that Jeff has sort of come up with this on his own. But at the time in the 70s, Gerard O'Neill, at least in some corners of, the scientific community was, a big deal. He was on 60 Minutes. He was quoted in newspaper articles like the Times. New York Times did a big story about some of his plans. His book, The High Frontier, in the 70s, was a really big deal. So, he did have that. He did have some reach. And it is interesting that it does endure, through Blue Origin today, or at least, they're trying to carry that forward.
Well, I don't know if you've seen this TV appearance. Probably you have. But, last year Wired interviewed Jeff Bezos. And apparently one of the conditions for the interview was that people had to watch this TV appearance with Gerard O'Neill and Isaac Asimov. Have you seen this?
Yeah, I have. And that's, where it talks about, as Blue Origin says, millions of people living and working in space. And so when I was telling the story earlier of trying to get Jeff to participate in the book and where I failed, and what I got from Gerard O'Neill's archive was a test from his that he gave to his first year physics students, and it was essentially along the lines of the question was it had to do with building, how big would your solar array have to be if you wanted to generate, X amount of power to sustain a colony of 50 people in space. I mean, so taking the sort of science fiction ideas of living in space, but then applying the real math to it to make it seem possible. And, and that's what he grew up in. While I didn't take the class, those are the sorts of things that Gerard O'Neill was talking about and applying, taking science fiction scenarios, but then, showing the math behind it for how it would actually work. And that's the thing that really resonated with people.
I mean, there's an interesting moment in this TV clip where the interviewer asks Isaac Asimov. He says, you've written science fiction for decades. You've written 200 books, whatever. Did you ever write about this idea of just human habitats floating in space? And Asimov says no, and I don't think anyone had. I think we've been planet chauvinists in a way.
That's right.
But that was something that Gerard O'Neill. It was a really new concept that he came up with.
Yeah, and so right. So actually, one of the chapters of my book is titled "Somewhere Else Entirely," because Gerard O'Neill posed the question, where should humanity go in space? Like, where do you go? Do you go to the moon? Do you go to Venus? Do you go to Mars? Or do you go to somewhere else entirely? And his answer was somewhere else entirely. That you don't have to go to any one place. And this is what differentiates Jeff from Elon, where Elon wants to colonize Mars and go to one single place, that if anything should happen on the Earth, if we get hit by an asteroid and there's an extinction event and we go the way of the dinosaurs, then humanity needs a backup. And Mars makes the most sense because, it has at least some atmosphere, it has gravity, it's not always minus 100 degrees, that, humanity could live there even though, it may not be entirely pleasant. But then there's this other idea that, no, we don't have to go to any particular place. We could just be in space. One of the other ideas that came from this futurist that, I don't know if Jeff read him or not, but he was aware of some of the ideas, came from a guy named Dandridge Cole, who had this idea that you could turn asteroids into habitats by, sort of coring out the middle of an asteroid and then living inside the asteroid. And I talked to one of Jeff's classmates at Princeton who was in the student space group, and he was sort of talking about this idea of how you live in an asteroid. And apparently one of the other students got really upset and said, how dare you, rape the cosmos and ruin, sort of acting as like an environmentalist, and what right do you have to, dig holes in rocks? And Jeff sort of said, and she stormed off, and Jeff apparently said something to the effect of, did she just defend the rights of the inalienable rights of a barren space rock? And everyone sort of burst into laughter. But that's the kind of thing that, he grew up at least, thinking about and spending a lot of time, focused on. And I always thought it was interesting that when he founded Blue Origin, one of the first people who was involved in the company was Neil Stephenson, the science fiction writer, who, was friends with Jeff and there from the very beginning, and had, wrote, a book like Seven Eves, for example, and really sophisticated, science fiction and looking into the future in a very sort of detailed and real way.
Well, right. And I was really surprised and excited to find out that Neil Stephenson had played such a critical role in the origins of Blue Origin. I had no idea about that. But so talk about they go to see a movie together, and that sort of kicks everything off.
Yeah. So they had been friends. I, obviously talked to Jeff and interviewed Neil Stephenson as well. And yeah, it's like, it was just sort of, Blue Origin was almost born on a lark. It was like 1998, 99. The two of them went to see October Sky, which was based on Homer Hickham's really tremendous memoir, Rocket Boys, about him, growing up in the coal country in West Virginia, but, just starting a rocket club when he was in school and firing off rockets. Anyway, Neil and Jeff went to see that. And I always liked, apparently Neil Stephenson's, someone in his family has a peanut allergy, and so he never could eat peanut butter or have it in the house. So Jeff told me he made peanut butter sandwiches for them to sneak into the movie theater, which I think is really funny now that the richest man in the world was sneaking in peanut butter sandwiches for them. And then anyway, they were in a coffee shop after, the movie, which is about, this young kid, chasing his space dreams. And he says to Neil Stephenson, I've always wanted to start a rocket company. That's always been my dream. And Neil Stephenson just said, do it today. And, soon thereafter, he did. And, it's really sort of interesting in that he founded it, but it wasn't, it wasn't like what it is now, where it's building rockets and hardware and engines. I mean, if anything, it was more like, a think tank that was doing research and development. And, with a group of about 4 people, and Neil Stephenson would, write in the morning, and then he would go in the afternoon. They had rented some, rundown warehouse in an industrial part of Seattle. And, really what they were doing with, Jeff's idea was, let's just start at the very beginning. And that, we've been going to space, since, the Mercury era, and even before, and Wernher von Braun firing off his V2 rockets. I mean, we've known about rocket technology, but let's take another look at it. And is there any other way to get to space besides chemically fueled rockets? So they spent, a couple of years just pondering that question and looking at all different sorts of ideas. And when I was interviewing Jeff for the book, and he looks at me, and I think my eyes are agog, because nobody knew any of this, and this was all new to me, that this is how they had started out. And he said, well, of course you're going to want to know, the more bizarre ideas that we had. And I think he's somewhat famous for throwing out ideas. Maybe they'll work, maybe they won't, but you at least have that outside the box thought. So he turned to me and he said, well, do you know how a bullwhip works? And I was like, well, what do you mean? He said, well, that crack, that actually there's a mini sonic boom in there, and that, you can generate the whip to go faster than the speed of sound just with your arm. And the way that works is momentum is mass times velocity. And so as your mass decreases toward the end of the whip, as it gets thinner, your velocity has to increase. And so I'm like digesting that and letting that sink in. And then I'm like, so you were going to bullwhip people into space? And he's like, well, no, not people. I mean, but maybe satellites or cargo or things like that. And he said, well, you could see this was an idea we had, that wasn't going to work. And then actually I was talking with Neil Stephenson about it. And, he was convinced actually that it could work, but if you're in space, and you're already, outside of the atmosphere in a zero gravity environment, that you could whip stuff around. And in Seven Eves, there's a part where they use a bullwhip to, in space. It's actually written into the book, and that came out of, some of those sessions they were having in the early days of Blue Origin.
Yeah, that's really cool. You said they were also talking about maybe just shooting stuff into space with giant cannons, like in Jules Verne, and having massive laser arrays that would all be focused on the ship that would sort of push it out into space.
Yeah, and, as sort of a heating source. And they were looking at all different sorts of things. I mean, if you're, a futurist and an engineer, it just would have been, sound like an extremely fun, almost like, graduate student assignment, to let's look at ways. And ultimately, they felt like they had done their due diligence, and that a chemically fueled rocket is the best way to get to orbit, but it's got to be reusable, right? And that's where they came to do that, which of course had something that SpaceX, they came to the same conclusion as well.
Right. And so Jeff Bezos, he gets to the point where, they've done all this high concept thinking, and it's time to actually start building rockets. And so he purchases sort of a ranch in Texas that's, half the size of Rhode Island, right? Yeah,
I mean, it's like, I think it's 360 or 70,000 acres. It's just massive. It's also where, he's building this 10,000-year clock. That's where it is, out in West Texas. And he did it, very secretively, because, people, if word gets out among the ranchers that, this rich guy is out buying all this land, they'll jack the prices up on him. So he created all of these, sort of shell companies, to buy the land, and they're all named for explorers, and then fall under, the Zephram LLC company. And what I open up the book with a scene where he's actually searching for his land in West Texas in 2003. And it's just this crazy story where they get into a helicopter crash as they're looking for property. And they're with us. They had hired a cowboy from the area who I talked to. He, it's hard tracking him down. I just had to call several ranches where he'd done work, and he doesn't have a cell phone or not connected to the internet or have email. I just finally called me after he had come in from being, driving the herd or something, and, told me the story, which, Jeff told me as well. where they're looking for land, and they're at one stop, and they're high up on a mountain. I mean, high for West Texas. I think they're about 5,000 feet or so altitude, and it was really hot. And so the air was thin, and Jeff's attorney was there, and then you had the helicopter pilot. So there were 4 of them crammed into this aircraft, and it was fully, loaded with fuel. So it was quite heavy. And the pilot couldn't get purchased, couldn't take off, and actually ended up crashing. One of the, fell on its side into this creek, which, believe it or not, was actually named Calamity Creek. And, they almost drowned. I mean, it was not a very deep creek, but, the cabin soon filled up with water. Jeff's attorney, they couldn't see her. She was completely submerged. They had to pull her out. The cowboy who I talked to, he had sustained some injuries and had to go to the hospital. And, the crazy thing about this story is, like, you can't make this stuff up. The helicopter pilot who Jeff had hired was named Cheater Bella, this sort of character from El Paso who had been arrested after he had flown a passenger into the New Mexico State Penitentiary in an attempt to free some of the inmates there. And he was later acquitted that this other person had him at gunpoint and wanted to, forced him to drive into the prison to free these inmates. But, and this is the guy who, the founder of Amazon has flying them all over West Texas. It's sort of hilarious stuff.
Well, you mentioned that the Blue Origin was sort of secretive, and that's a major theme in the book, just how secretive they are compared to SpaceX, to pick an obvious example. But there's a line in the book where you say, so one of their Blue Origin, one of their rockets blows up and it creates this loud bang that's heard all over the county or whatever. And there's a line about how Blue Origin was prevailed upon that they had to release a statement about this because their silence and secrecy was just encouraging conspiracy theories to spread. And I was just curious what sort of conspiracy theories have grown up around Blue Origin's secrecy.
Yeah, well, anytime you are that quiet and that secretive, like, people are going to fill in the blanks on their own. And particularly, you're out in West Texas, you've got all of this land. Who knows what's going on out there? There's cameras and fences, and then all of a sudden there's this explosion. And people knew, that it was that he had a space company there. He had been flying rockets, and so they ultimately ended up calling NASA and saying, like, what was going on? But of course, NASA had nothing to do with it. And they were, so finally, the head of communications for NASA had to call Blue Origin's PR reps and was like, guys, you can't just be quiet on this. You have to say something. You owe, some level of transparency. So ultimately then, however long it was later, they did, put out a statement on it. But that was the sort of thing they had to sort of, force them into saying anything, even when something as dramatic and that could affect the public as a rocket explosion.
Right. And so since the company has kept such a low profile, as you were saying, a lot of people just aren't aware of what they've done. So just for people who haven't been paying close attention, just what has Blue Origin accomplished so far?
So they've had, as of today, I think it's 9 flights. Their first step is a rocket called New Shepard. And, I'll just back up a minute. They take sort of a very step-by-step approach. So first rocket is called New Shepard, named after Alan Shepard, who was the first American to go to space. He went on a suborbital mission up and down, and that's what New Shepard does. It doesn't get to orbit, but it goes up and then it comes back down. They ultimately want to take, paying customers, tourists, like Virgin Galactic does in this, where you sort of buckle up. They haven't said how much they charge, but you're in the space capsule and it launches vertically. And you would, go up and have a few minutes above the Kármán line or 100 kilometers, where you get to float around the cabin, see the, curvature of the Earth, land masses without boundaries, the darkness of space beyond, the thin line of the atmosphere, and then come back down. It's next looking at a rocket that would go to orbit, named after John Glenn. So it's called New Glenn, and John Glenn obviously was the first American to go to orbit. They've got this massive factory down, it's right outside the Kennedy Space Center, where they're going to be building that rocket. They've got a launch pad now at Cape Canaveral that they're renovating in anticipation of flying that rocket. They've got a new engine, which is significant. It's a sort of a significant thing to build a new engine. Even the United Launch Alliance, which is the big, joint venture between Lockheed Martin and Boeing, for their Atlas V rocket, they use an engine that's made in Russia, actually. So it's a big deal for them to build an engine in-house. And they've actually are selling that to the United Launch Alliance for their next generation rocket. So that's, so the big steps for them, coming up this year is possibly the first flights with people on their new Shepard rocket, and then within a couple of years flying New Glenn for the first time. They're looked to have paying customers to do that. So, in some ways it's really just beginning for them.
Now, there's a part in the book where Blue Origin files a patent on the idea of landing a spacecraft at sea. And Elon Musk is scandalized by this because he says this is not a new idea by any stretch of the imagination. Kind of what was your take on Blue Origin filing that patent?
Yeah, and it's something that you see that Amazon, does too. They go out and they file patents. I mean, and Elon immediately took issue with it. There was a lot of discussion about this concept, by people who are looking at it seriously. And then even in science fiction, there's like some Russian movie from like the 50s or 60s that actually where this happens, and you see the booster landing on a boat at sea. Elon's, SpaceX's attorneys, challenged the patent and, filed a, legal challenge, and they won. To me, it was indicative of a time when there was a lot of tension between the two companies, between, Elon and Jeff. I think it was previous to that was the fight over Launch Complex 39A, which is, in, space real estate is, some of the most sacrosanct land, you can imagine. It's the launch pad at the Kennedy Space Center where, the Apollo moon missions went off from. I mean, the Saturn V and Apollo 11 that took Neil Armstrong and Buzz Aldrin and Michael Collins to the moon, that launched from 39A. The first and last shuttle missions were from 39A. But when the shuttle retired in 2011, and 39A is just sitting there wasting away. I mean, literally rusting away. And NASA's like, what do we do with this thing? Who would even want it? So initially, SpaceX by then had been launching rockets and showing itself as a really viable force in the launch industry, and they jumped at the chance to grab it, and sort of at the last minute, Blue Origin filed this protest and said, wait, if there's going to be the government can't just be giving out surplus property, there has to be a competitive bidding process, which they forced, and it really angered SpaceX and Elon. I mean, because this was 2011, 2013, somewhere in there. And, Blue Origin had yet to go to space, even on a suborbital vehicle, let alone, a rocket that could get to orbit. And Elon fired off this email to Space News, which was covering it, pointing that out, that they don't have a rocket. And, if they were able to build a rocket, that meets the qualifications for, 39A, that he would gladly share the pad with them. But he said the chances of them being able to do that, the chances were greater of unicorns dancing in the flame duct, which is one of the great takedowns in the history of takedowns, I think. I mean, just, so you had tension building between the two, between that and that patent lawsuit. And, SpaceX ultimately prevailed in both of those.
So, I mean, when Blue Origin files a patent like that, do you think that Jeff Bezos is thinking all's fair in love and war, or in his head, does he think that there's a legitimate case for that patent?
It's hard to say. I mean, I think, from a business perspective, you want to gobble up all the real estate you can. And it also, serves to let people know what he's thinking about. In this case, since he lost, and in a sort of public way, in an embarrassing way. I don't know if it was the best choice because Elon made a big deal out of it, and it didn't really make him look good.
So One thing I thought was interesting is that there was an interview in 2005 in Time magazine that Jeff Bezos gave where he talked about reading Alastair Reynolds, who's a really great science fiction author. But I just think it's interesting that someone as busy as he is, obviously, still finds time to read science fiction even today.
Yeah, and I got that sense that that's important to him to sort of nourish his mind, to kind of keep that stuff up and to keep going even today. I'm he's friends with Neil Stephenson, and then read Seven Eves, which actually was dedicated to him. I think he was reading Ready Player One not too long ago too, so he definitely tries to keep up on that stuff. Although I think a while ago you could see what he was reading on Amazon and the reviews he was leaving, and at one point he had mentioned too, somebody asked him what he was reading, and it's this very technical engineering book on, rocket engine development, so that sort of gave you some hint early on what his plans were.
Mm-hmm. Is there any other science fiction that he likes that you know about that didn't make it into your book?
I don't think so. I know Asimov, Heinlein. I was at an event where Robert Heinlein's estate gave him a very prestigious award, which actually Peter Diamandis had won previously. I think Elon Musk had also won. And during that ceremony, Jeff, talked about, what, Heinlein had meant to him.
I mean, so I mentioned that kind of what got me interested in Jeff Bezos initially was that he had saved The Expanse. Did you follow that story at all?
I remember when that happened. I confess I haven't watched it, but I think that something that that Jeff wants to do and Elon wants to do is to not just have success in space, to build rockets that are reusable, but to reinvigorate interest in space is important to them. I mean, when they grew up, they were interested in it. Jeff talks about being 5 years old and watching Neil Armstrong walk on the moon. He said that was a seminal moment for him. He obviously was a huge Trekkie and a science fiction fan, obsessed by NASA, and as you said, what government agency inspires seventh graders, right? Like the IR people aren't, growing up wanting to, go work for the IRS or the Department of Agriculture, but he was really inspired by NASA. And Elon Musk early on, wanted to have he had this crazy idea where he wanted to fly a plant to the surface of Mars, which Ashley Vance wrote about in his book. And the point of that was to sort of show life on Mars, green, leafy, live object, a plant on the sort of dead, lifeless, orange surface of Mars. But in order to do that, to help boost NASA's status and its standing, and to boost more funding for the agency. And you've seen, SpaceX almost is like its own, live TV show, its own reality TV show that people are watching and following along. And in many cases, they've got a lot of fans and a lot of devotees, and almost single-handedly reinvigorating interest in space. The way we were interested in space in the 60s and 70s. And just, now today, it's like space isn't part of the national consciousness anymore. Except for the historical sense, except for, the 1961 John F. Kennedy speech, we're going to go to the moon before the, decade is out. We'll do it because it's hard. That's how it is. But, but they want it to be, current. And, I thought the Saving the Expanse is a great way, to do that and to keep that going. And, I'm sure Jeff watches and is a fan.
No, he definitely is. Yeah, he said that. I'll also just mention that Amazon has been moving pretty aggressively to develop other science fiction properties. Ian Banks' Culture series, Larry Niven's Ringworld, and Neil Stephenson's Snow Crash are all reportedly in development. And word is that, a directive has come down directly from Jeff Bezos that he wants more science fiction on their streaming service.
Yeah, and, so I was, Amazon and Jeff throw this conference every year called Mars. It stands for Machine Learning, Automation, Robotics, and Space. And I went a couple years ago, and one of the speakers at the conference was Andy Weir, the author of The Martian. And I know Jeff was a fan of that, and Neil Stephenson and Andy Weir did a sit down when Andy's latest book came out, and I think it sort of goes in line with their personal interests, but also their professional ones, because the more people are interested in space, the better it is, frankly, for their business as well. But I do think it's a personal passion.
Right. One line from your book that kind of jumps out at me is that Jeff Bezos says, on the internet today, 2 kids in their dorm room can reinvent an industry because the heavy lifting infrastructure is in place for that. 2 kids in their dorm room can't do anything interesting in space. Could you talk about what would it look like for 2 kids in their dorm room to be able to do interesting things in space?
Yeah, so just to back up on that for a minute, so his point is it's like when he started Amazon, like the infrastructure was there. The telephone company had put down the cable lines that were then used for the internet, and he was selling books on Amazon, and the postal service could deliver the books for him, and there was this technology called the credit card where he could take people's payments. So all of that was there, right? So he and anybody else or Elon Musk could start PayPal. But that's not there in space. It's just too difficult to get to space. It's too expensive. It's been, governments and nations have had long held monopolies on space travel for a reason. It just took the resources of a nation to be able to do it. It's a hard financial challenge. It's a hard physics problem. It just takes an extraordinary amount of energy to go up. It's still very dangerous. What he wants to do, and what Elon wants to do, all of them want to do, is to make access to space more routine and more reliable. That's where you get the reusability and reusing the rockets to help bring down the cost. But once that infrastructure is in place, that's just the railroad going west. And then what happens when you get, to California? And he hopes that there is this sort of, as he says, economic dynamism that happens in space where, there are all kinds of entrepreneurial efforts that flourish. What those would be, we're talking, now probably a couple generations out. We probably don't even know. There are so many unknowns, but, people talk about manufacturing in space, more science experiments, asteroid mining, energy resources in space, harnessing that energy, bring it back to Earth. But as he said, that if he's 80 years old and looks back on his life and has seen that infrastructure to space start to really take hold, then he would be a happy 80-year-old.
What is kind of the current status of efforts to mine asteroids you mentioned? And you also talk about hotels in space, kind of what's going on with that right now?
Well, so with hotels in space, sort of a really interesting time. I think there are 2 or 3 main players and sort of companies that want to build habitats in space. One of them, Bigelow Aerospace, their concept is to not build, big steel, metal, metallic structures in space and assemble them in space, but to build inflatable habitats that are made out of almost like a Kevlar-like material that you pack into the nose cone of a rocket, and then when it gets to space, you can inflate it, almost like a balloon. And actually, one of these habitats is currently attached to the International Space Station and has been for some time, as sort of a test. And the astronauts, go in and take test readings on it, and it all seems to be performing well. And this becomes sort of a key question, that actually NASA and the Trump administration have highlighted, like what happens after the International Space Station. It's been continuously inhabited for now almost 19 years. It's getting older. At some point, it can't stay up there forever. At some point, you're gonna need another place to go. And so, the White House floated this idea, which, Congress is opposed to, of ending direct funding to the International Space Station by 2025 and seeing if there's some commercial entity that could take it over. So that's sort of a really fits into the sort of broader context of, trying to commercialize low Earth orbit. And, I don't know how viable that is, but, the space habitats is a big part of it. Now, the space mining aspect of it is, sort of really sexy and interesting and gets a lot of attention. But, the main player there, a company called Planetary Resources, basically was acquired by another company and doesn't look like, they're going to have any success at all doing that. I think, that maybe they were just a little bit too early. But, that's, I think, as, it's an emerging space industry is starting to come to fruition in these early years. I think it's, it's going to be tumultuous, and there are going to be startups, and there are going to be companies that flourish and companies that fail. And, that's, I think, what you're seeing, particularly with asteroid mining. And we'll see with these habitats, how many of these companies will actually flourish. Will they have enough demand and customers who can afford to use them, whether that's, other countries wanting to start astronaut programs or companies wanting to do research. I mean, we'll see.
You quote a Goldman Sachs analyst as saying a single asteroid the size of a football field could contain $25 billion to $50 billion worth of platinum.
Yeah. And, so this is the thing, what I've noticed just in reporting this over the last 5 years, is how the investment community is becoming more interested in space. I mean, I think early on, space investors were, the space geeks. They were the enthusiasts. They were, just more interested in the dream than they were perhaps on the return in investment. But now you've seen more players get into this. I mean, the fact that Google and Fidelity invested $1 billion into SpaceX should tell you something. And the fact that, companies like Morgan Stanley are talking about it. Whereas they used to say, the quickest way to become a millionaire in space was to start out as a billionaire. Now I think people are starting to believe that actually you can make money in space. And, as a reporter, they say follow the money, and I've been watching more and more go into it. Now, that's not to say that this is all going to pan out and there won't be some sort of a reset and that there are these waves that come through. But, this one seems perhaps more promising than previous ones.
In the book, you quote Jeff Bezos as saying that the solar system could support 1 trillion people if we build space habitats and harness all the energy of the sun and so forth. Do you know how rigorously that's been analyzed and what other people think about that figure of 1 trillion people?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's his more, O'Neillian, vision of the future that's, hundreds of years out. And I think that's something that, to a lesser degree, Jeff does, Elon certainly does, but, it gets to this idea of wanting to set a goal and a high point and a version of the future that's optimistic and hopeful. And, I think Elon and Jeff would both tell you that by nature they're, sort of optimists and want to, look to the future. And it's a way to, motivate themselves and to motivate the workers at their companies, if they feel like they're working, toward this future. I don't know, 1 trillion is any of it is sustainable or real, but it's an interesting concept to think about. He talks about, what if there were, the human race really flourishes and it just is able to expand off the surface of the earth. And, you've got hundreds of Einsteins and hundreds of Beethovens. And it's sort of an interesting thing, to ponder. It doesn't get into, sort of the downsides of, there are obviously some bad apples here and there. What about the Adolf Hitlers and, war? But, I think it's more really, sort of a concept and a vision and a dream than anything else.
Well, there's a line where he says, the people who go into this industry do it because they are missionaries. And Elon Musk said something similar, that this would never happen without, I think he called it an ideological drive or something. But this idea that just, maybe free market forces alone aren't going to make human colonization of space happen. There has to be almost a religious zeal behind it.
Yeah. And that's what, and Elon has said, like, there's got to be something more to life than just waking up and facing challenges and solving one problem after another, and that, the adventure of, and the promise of exploration, that inspiring vision of the future is what motivates him, and there's a scene that I wrote about in the book where he's at this space conference in Mexico, and he's giving this big Mars talk, and and he's doing just that. And here's this rocket that he's building, but it really just exists on paper. And here's how we're going to go to Mars, and it's going to be this great trip, and there'll be theaters on board, and he's sort of painting this very romantic vision that's somewhat divorced from reality. I mean, he was asked, well, what about like radiation, which is a big problem in going particularly to Mars, and he sort of discounted it. And he takes a lot of heat for that, but I think there is, it's done on purpose, I think, and it's done to sort of create this hopeful vision to inspire people. I mean, just more recently, SpaceX announced they were taking this Japanese billionaire on a trip around the moon. And, I don't know when or even if that will ever happen. The rocket they're talking about doing this on doesn't exist. But I think for them, they see some value in, just putting that out there and talking about it. And that this is our, the future that we want to happen. And, the way to make it happen is first to sort of imagine it and then, to build it. And,
right.
The thing is that, you can discount them and, come with a level of skepticism, which of course, I do as a journalist and, try to hold them accountable and press for those sorts of answers. But, on all of the other steps, no one said it was, people discounted, particularly SpaceX from the very beginning. They said this was impossible. You can't start a space company. And I think that's one of the reasons why Jeff Bezos was so quiet about it, that, he would have been met with ridicule, certainly that people would say, there's no way you can do this and be successful. So why not just talk about it until after you've done it? And, everyone told Elon he couldn't build a rocket that could land. Everyone told him he couldn't fly the Falcon Heavy rocket, which he did. So, sometimes it's hard to bet against them.
Right. I liked the line. You quote Burt Rutan in the book as saying something like, you're not doing research unless everyone is telling you it can't be done.
Right. Yeah. And that's, that's how they all, and Burt Rutan, built Spaceship One, which won the Ansari X Prize as the first commercial vehicle to go to space. And people were doubting him. And now guess where Spaceship One is? It's in the Air and Space Museum, hanging in the rafters next to the Spirit of St. Louis. Right. So there you go.
We mentioned that there have been a bunch of books in this space recently. There was Ashley Vance's book and Julian Guthrie's book. There's also a book called The Rocket Billionaires by Tim Fahrenholtz that covers similar ground, I think. I was just curious if you have you read that, or were you paying attention to that at all?
Yeah, I know about it. I know Tim. He's a great reporter. I saw him at events, and I knew he was doing his, and I was doing mine. I haven't read it, but I know Tim's he's a great guy and a really wonderful reporter.
So are you like the Jeff Bezos and Elon Musk of writing books about Jeff Bezos and Elon Musk?
I guess so. I mean, I think competition is good. I mean, the key thing, if you allow me to point out, though, that, I took great pains in my book to do the research and actually to spend time. I interviewed all 4 billionaires and then, with people within the company as well. And I think that kind of, access is really important when you're doing this kind of work, particularly with a book. You need to hear from the people involved.
Yeah. All right. So we're pretty much out of time. I heard that you're maybe going to write a follow-up book to this at some point.
Who knows? I mean, we'll see what the next year or two brings. I mean, 2019 could be a really big year in space. I mean, we're talking about 4 different spacecraft that could fly humans in space in 2019. I mean, who knows if that'll all happen, but that would really be extraordinary. So this could be shaping up to be a big year.
So do you have a title in mind for a follow-up book?
Not yet. Any ideas?
What would be like the Space Emperors, maybe?
Right. The Space Emperors. I love it. I'll put that on the list.
All right. Yeah. I hope you give me credit in the acknowledgments.
You got it.
All right. Great. So yes, we've been speaking with Christian Davenport about his new book, The Space Barons. So Chris, thank you so much for joining us.
Yeah. Thanks for having me. That was a lot of fun.
And that was our interview. So big thanks again to Christian Davenport for joining us on the show. Special thanks as well to Linda Hacker and Marta MV, who both just signed up this week to support us on Patreon. Geek's Guide to the Galaxy is made possible thanks to support from listeners like you. So if you enjoy the show and want it to continue, please sign up to give us $1 or $2 per episode over at patreon.com/geeks. And if you'd rather make a one-time contribution, you can do that via check or PayPal over at geeksguideshow.com/crowdfunding. So big thanks again to everyone who's contributed. We really appreciate it. All right, so that was our show. So thanks everyone for listening, and we'll see you next time.
The Geek's Guide to the Galaxy is a production of Wired.com. For more information about the show, visit geeksguideshow.com. To learn more about your host, visit davidbarkirtley.com. Music and voiceover produced by yours truly, Jack Kincaid. If you enjoyed this program, tell your friends. If you didn't enjoy it, tell no one. Thank you for listening.